Welcome back to my Master License Guide series, part 3 of 5, International B. By the time that I had decided to make this series, I had already finished the first 2 licenses, but I'd only just gotten started on the third. So a lot of what you're going to see is actually my very first time trying any of these. Our first test is a famous Ferrari and a famous corner on a famous track in Italy. Jumping right into the test, as you start off, you want to look to the left side of the track and you're going to see a 200 meter board on the fence followed by the 150 meter board in the grass. Directly before the 150 meter board, we want to hit the brakes. Downshift to third and continue braking hard in a straight line. Right when we get to the 50 meter board is when we want to turn in. I turned in a little bit too late and completely missed the apex unfortunately, but I kept up enough speed that I was able to get on the throttle and find my way out. Now when you start getting on the throttle, you're probably going to experience a little bit of understeer. You can notice that I'm getting on the throttle and then off the throttle in a rhythm. What I'm trying to do is get the weight to transfer to the front, but not stay off the throttle long enough that I slow down. You can do this and find a lot of grip in the front end, but what you've got to be careful of is hitting that throttle too hard or going off the track. The offside of the track is really slippery, and when you get on the throttle too quickly, you can get a lot of oversteer really easily. So be very gentle as you're pumping the throttle. We're going to go over at full speed now, and what I want you to pay attention to is how much the weight shifts back and forth as I'm getting on and off the throttle. You'll also be able to hear the front tire squealing as I'm going into the corner. I think second gear will probably be faster, but it's also a really good way to upset the balance of the car. Now, as I'm getting on and off the throttle, you can see the front end lifting a little bit, and as you do that, if you do it too quickly, it can really upset the balance of the car. And on top of that, with how much power it has, it can make it oversteer really easily, so you've got to be really careful about that. Up next, we've got a C4 Corvette at the very treacherous final corner of Big Willow. I personally think this is incredibly difficult because the main braking zone is at the very edge of a really dangerous corner, so let's get into it. There aren't a lot of good markers on the track, anything really distinct to look for, but the track does curve to the left and then straighten out just in time for us to start turning in. As you can see right here, the track on the left is perfectly straight, and it's right about then that we want to start turning in. What I like to do is start turning in until I experience a little bit of understeer, and then I start lifting the throttle just gently to make sure that I can start getting closer to the inside of the track. As we pass by the white and green column on the right, we know we can get back on the throttle, but we want to continue steering into the corner. Ease your way over to the 250 board, which is the first one, and try to line yourself with the outside of the track. We're going to brake right at the 200 board. Be very careful with your placement and the pressure that you're putting on the brakes. If you brake too hard or too quickly, you can understeer directly off the track. I give about 80% brake. Take note of how I'm slightly releasing the braking pressure while steering along the side of the road to make sure that I don't go entirely off, but stay close enough so that I can fully turn in at the 20 board. The car might not start turning in initially, but when you get fully on the throttle, it should turn in as long as you let off enough speed. Putting a tire off here will probably make your car jump and then slide off the track, so I just like to avoid doing that at all. Continue steering to make sure that you don't go off the track, and then steer in a little bit more because the pit entry is a little bit deceptive. That wasn't a perfect run, and we were still 7/10 clear of gold, so I think this one probably has a good margin of error. Watching full speed, I think you can see a little bit clearer how it straightens out right as you want to start turning in. I want you to take note of how much it understeers on turn in. I make sure to gradually get myself all the way to the outside of the track, and I also want you to take note of how much it oversteers on braking. Being right on the limit of sliding out is one of the keys to being really fast, and I think it's also really important to be able to control these situations, so I didn't want to refilm this for a really stable run because 1, probably wouldn't be as fast, and 2, you need to be able to do that eventually, so get to practicing. For the next test, we have the hardest of the snow driving tests so far. It features multiple corners as well as, you know what, I'm going to try to explain a slightly advanced rally technique. For the last snow test, we really just kind of lifted off the throttle, hit the brakes, and allowed that to rotate the car, but we're going to try what's known as the Scandinavian flick. We want to turn in at this yellow barrel, but we also want to keep up a lot of speed, and we don't want to slow down too much. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to shift the weight to the right side of the car by steering to the left, and then we're going to swing it back the other way. The transference of the weight allows the car to rotate while not losing as much speed. With the car now rotating sideways, but our momentum still going mainly the direction we were initially going when we threw it into the corner, we can now use the throttle to guide the car the way that it's facing rather than the initial way that it started. The difference in the original direction it was moving, plus the way it's facing after rotating it, is the angle that you're going to drift. Adding some brake, downshifting, and modulating the throttle can allow the car to slow down, as well as slow down the tires and wheels individually, so they're not just completely sliding sideways. You need a little bit of grip, so blending the right amount of slide with grip is the key to keeping speed in rally courses. If you're just sliding the tires at max speed, you're going to lose a lot of momentum, but if you're not sliding at all, you're just going to understeer everywhere. Using these techniques to guide your car along a traditional line would usually be advised. However, this track is unique. The fact that the outside edge is banked like this means that if you slide just right and you slide all the way up on the bank, you can kind of use it to ramp back down and get a really good launch onto the next straight. Like in the Ferrari test, there are lots of yellow signs that we can see, this time yellow barrels, and they tell us when we want to turn in. When it comes to rally or snow rally, you want to make sure that you're constantly rotating just a little bit. If you're not rotating, you're probably understeering, and understeering is going to be very slow. One rule that I always follow when it comes to rally tracks is trying to point my nose at the inside of the track. We're going to take this right-hand corner. We're starting really early. The longer the corner, the earlier we need to initiate. And you'll notice that my nose is constantly pointed towards the right, more so than the angle of the corner that I'm trying to hit. I want you to notice that as soon as I pass the apex for this first right-hand corner, I'm going to follow that same rule and point my nose at the left-handed apex for the next left-hand corner. I didn't quite bleed off enough speed for the left-hander, so I had to slow down at the exit, which obviously isn't optimal, but we were able to keep up enough momentum and I was able to steer away from this wall enough that we didn't lose all of the lead that we had on the Ghost, and it was a pretty easy gold. This is my first time ever trying to explain this kind of concept, so bear with me if it doesn't make a lot of sense, and please ask me questions in the comments if you have any. With an all-wheel drive car, it's common to actually steer into the corners rather than counter-steer a lot because the front tires are gripping as well, so pay attention to the steering as well as the braking and throttle inputs. You're going to notice that I'm not always at full throttle, even when I'm trying to slide, and I'm frequently steering into the corner even when I'm already sliding too. I know there's a lot of information, so the one main thing I want you to think about is that you should constantly be oversteering a little bit for the corners, and I want you to face your nose towards the inside corners at all times. If you stick to those rules, then the rest of it should come together. And like I said before, this is my first time explaining it, so please don't hesitate to ask me detailed questions in the comments if it's all confusing. So for this next test, it's actually one of my favorites, and it's going to be the first one where I hadn't actually seen it before I started filming this. So we're going to take a little bit of a departure from the usual layout of these guides, and I'm actually going to show you the raw footage of me initially getting gold, but then trying to whittle my time down and kind of talk about the process that I go through when I try to figure these things out. So as we start, I'm relatively familiar with the dynamics of this car, and I know what line I want to take for this section of the track. I made a pretty good guess on exactly how to place the car initially, but then it turned in a lot more than I thought it would, and going into the next corner, it turned in more than I thought it would again, so that's why I ended up going directly over the grass. I tried to carry more speed and completely missed the line I wanted to take, and then on the final portion of it, I kind of got it, but I was going way too slow, and because I slowed down too much, I oversteered. So in my head, my main thought is this car can turn in even when I'm going much faster and when I'm already on the throttle, so I need to carry much more speed through each one of these corners. So noting in my mind that I wanted to carry more speed through most of the corners, I did remember that I hit the right line on the first corner, but what I didn't realize is I was going too slow. Because of that, I ended up going too slow again. The car turned in more than I expected, but I was able to adjust and almost hit the right line on that left-hander. I was much closer than I thought I would be on this right-hander, and I was feeling extra confident. Knowing that I could really throw the car in, I had more confidence here, but I still wasn't going nearly fast enough, so I apexed early and then went directly off the track. Try 3. I know that I want to carry more speed on the first corner, and I've almost got the feeling of the car tuned in for the rest of it. This time going in, I don't touch the brakes whatsoever, I just modulate the throttle, and that allows me to then brake correctly and hit the second apex the way I wanted to. I was then carrying too much speed and missed the line I wanted for the left-hander, so we had to restart. We already had gold, but I wanted to get a better time just personally, and also because I knew I was filming for the guide, I wanted to set a really good example for it. So we went again. Before we finish this, I am going to mention that I ended up just a half of a tenth off of the global top 10 at the time, and then I went back and I think I got into the top 5, but either way, this was a pretty good lap. Really close to the top 10, and we're going to go ahead and break it down after this. But as you can see, I felt a lot more confident. I knew where to place the car. I'm way ahead of both Ghosts, and yeah, we actually ended up cutting off 2 more tenths from my best time. So unlike usual, we're going to now break it down at the end of the example. The first turning comes really fast at the beginning of this, so luckily we have some nice tire marks to guide us exactly where we want to go. Start turning in and then lift the throttle accordingly so you can get the left tires all the way up on the curb. Continue steering left until you are approximately halfway between the two curbs, then switch directions, brake just enough so you bleed off speed and you can put just the right tires on this curb, going all the way over it. Continue turning until you reach the end of the curb on the left right here, to then switch directions, again lifting off the throttle a little bit. We want to use all of this curb right here. Continue steering left, but don't worry about getting all the way on the left side of the track. You can get right up next to this curb. What we're going to try to do is turn onto it, brake, and hug it the entire time. It's technically like a double apex, but if you just ride it the entire time, you'll be totally fine. Add just enough throttle that it doesn't change your trajectory, continue turning right, and there's a very convenient little line in the middle of the track to let us know when we want to change directions. Lift off the throttle, add a little bit of brake, and then get on the throttle so you can use just 2 tires on the left curb, and then track out without going all the way off the track. Maintaining a good rhythm and maintaining momentum are the keys to success on this specific test. Final note, I did not realize you do not need to shift up to 4th gear. You can keep it in 3rd and save yourself the time of a shift. Test IB5 is a big section of Watkins Glen, which is one of my favorite tracks. I hadn't driven it till it was added to Gran Turismo 7, and I absolutely fell in love with it. Anyone who's driven here knows that this next chicane that we're going to go through, the first chicane of this, the bus stop, is incredibly tricky, incredibly difficult, but I actually think this entire test is super difficult. The first thing I want you to think about as we're approaching the very first braking zone is I want you to look at how much I'm braking. I'm not going 100% braking, though you probably still could, but I'm giving it about 90% brake so I can continue steering as I'm slowing down. Brake at about 450 feet and immediately start turning for the first corner. Carrying this much speed into the corner actually caused it to start rotating, so you'll see that I'm counter steering before we actually go over the curb. Even if you're not sliding here, you're still going to want to start turning even before you get to the curb. This car has pretty soft suspension. It is a road car and will take some time to react. I hit this curb a little too quickly and completely missed the second one, but we kept up so much speed that it didn't matter. As we went over this curb, you can keep only 2 tires on that curb and you'll be totally fine here. The beginning of the curb here on the right is a good place to start braking, but I want you to take note of how little I'm braking. I'm going to brake just a little bit to get the weight shifted forward and allow the car to decelerate just enough that we keep speed, but also start tucking ourselves in towards the inside of the corner. Modulating the throttle to keep ourselves going fast, but also getting closer and closer to the inside is really important. We're in 4th gear now. Our clipping point is right about where the marshals are in the shack to the right. Continue steering in as you get on the throttle, and you can again use just 2 tires on the outside of this curb here, but make sure you're back all the way on the track by the time you get to the white line. Our next braking point is about 10 to 15 feet before the 200-foot board on the right. You'll notice I get some oversteer as I lift off the brakes, but I think that's just because I lifted off the brakes too quickly rather than braking too late. I think you can still brake where I brake and make it as long as you're more gentle coming off of the brakes. This car responds pretty well to just modulating the throttle in a rhythm if you remember from that first test with the Ferrari, so it's totally fine to get on the throttle and just play with that to try to get your car pointed where you want it. Avoid using too much of the runoff on the right because it is really slippery. When you get here, you want to brake right after the 200-foot board on the left. I once again got a lot of rotation coming off the brakes, but this time it helped more than it hurt because I was able to use the throttle both to fix my line, but getting on the throttle that early also allowed us to get a really good run up the hill. From here, we just want to make sure we don't let our car steer into the grass, we correct any kind of oversteer, and then we stay floored until we cross the finish line. Going full speed is going to be a little bit easier to see the oversteer that I got as I braked and turned in. Bleeding off more speed would have allowed us to hit the second apex and then get a better line going into the next right-hander, but since I had so much speed going through it, I just decided to stick with it, and it was definitely more than enough to get the gold. You've got to be really patient with this corner. You've got to get on the throttle pretty much before you can even see or exit, but if you get on the throttle too early, you can give yourself a penalty like I did in the finals of the Porsche Esports Challenge, and you do not want to do that. Rotation coming off of braking is, in my opinion, the best way you can slide a car, but too much of it like that is just going to waste time. I once again braked deep and got some rotation going into this right-hander, but again it was too much and you're probably better off just not sliding whatsoever. But if you had to choose, rotation on corner entry is the safest way to slide and definitely the fastest. A scruffy lap like that being 7/10 clear of gold tells me that you should be able to get that pretty easily. Our next test is a really fun car at a very tricky part of an extremely tricky track. If you play a lot of sport mode, you're probably really familiar with this track, and if not, it might be a surprise to you because a lot of these corners do not actually work the way that they look like they do. I think 2 or 3 of the other tests in this license test took me 3 or 4 attempts. This one took me 5 or 6, so this one was definitely tricky for me. As this test starts, we're going to move all the way to the right side of the track, and when we get to that first curb on the outside, that's when we're going to turn in. I don't want you to start lifting until you get closer to the apex because we don't really need to tuck it in until we get past that. And I also want you to notice that I'm using still about 80% throttle when I am lifting. You're really going to have to use your sight looking at the next apex you want to hit, as well as your best judgment to know when to turn in. But if you need something really concrete, if you look at this barrier on the right, the lowest part of it is when you want to start turning in. Once again, we're staying full throttle as we initially turn in, and we're lifting just barely to make sure that we have the right curve going past that apex. You want to steer as little as possible, but if you go in the grass, it's going to act like a vacuum cleaner and suck your car directly off the track. There's a white part of the barrier all the way on the right that's a pretty good braking marker, but I like to just focus on getting all the way up on the curb, and when both my front and back tire are on the curb, that's when I start braking. Brake in a straight line, but when you get to the 50-meter board, that's when we're going to turn in and start trail braking. I've mentioned this in the past, but using as much of the curbing as you possibly can on this track is key. Putting your left tires all the way on the red and white part is the best way to get as much speed from this track as you possibly can. The exit curbing here is a different story. As you can see, there are essentially 2 different parts of the red and white curb, and the far part is really high. You want to avoid that at all costs. At the very end of this curb, we're going to brake and turn in one more time. You can still put the left tires on the red and white curb here, putting the right tires on the grass. However, it's kind of bumpy as you go over it, so I chose to avoid it this time. Continue turning until the left side of your car is pointed directly at the next curb, and then go straight at it. Follow this curb, but miss the yellow sausage curb on the inside. Start tracking out to the orange barrier that you see in the distance. Being careful not to go in the grass because it is blind over this crest, you want to put just your outside tires on the red and white curb here, and then look for the tire marks that are at the edge of it. Brake at the beginning of the darkest part of the tire marks here. Downshift, turn in, and start spotting your exit. You can actually put the right tires on the very inside part of the red and white curb here, but I took it safe and took a more traditional line over it. You can use this track runoff here, and I do suggest using it. However, if you use too much of it and you go all the way out in the grass here, obviously you're going to slide in that wall, and we do not want that. Make sure you steer yourself all the way back on the track before you hit the grass, or it can be a very late failure, and that does not feel good. As you go full speed, you can see in real time just how little I'm lifting off the throttle, and I'm doing it very briefly too. Making sure that we don't lift off too much or too early allows us to keep a lot of momentum as we're going through those corners, which is really important because it is uphill. I try to treat these 2 corners as one big corner. They are 2 different corners, but if you treat it like one big arch that you're just kind of tightening up at the end, then it kind of makes it easier to wrap your head around. All of these corners have the caveat that you can cut almost the entire thing as long as you're wary of what the high parts of the curb are going to do to your car. Like I said, this one we could have actually put the right tires about 5 feet more to the left, which would have allowed us to get on the throttle a lot earlier, but it's not really necessary, and we cleared this one with half a second, so this should be pretty easy. The 7th test is an extremely powerful car at a very tricky part of the world-famous Spa. Featuring a chicane followed by a few downhill elevation change type corners, this can be very, very tricky, especially with how much power this car has. Just like Gallo says, you've got to be careful when you're accelerating. This definitely has enough power to send you sideways at pretty much any part of the test. For most race cars, the regular meter boards will suffice, but this thing is a very fast street car, so you actually have to look for the 200-meter board on the fence. We're going to be braking in a straight line for a very long time. Get down to 3rd gear and keep your eyes on the 50-meter board in the distance. Turn in as you pass it, and you want to get as close to both of the bollards as you possibly can. Continue steering as you pass them because we need to hit a late apex on this left-hand corner. Take note of how long I'm waiting to switch directions and turn back left. You can use a lot of the curb, but try not to go up on the green. It can make your car bounce off. You want to sneak in as much full throttle as you can, getting all the way to the left, and look for the end of the colored barrier on the right. That's when we're going to switch directions. Lift as you turn in, dab the brakes just barely, and try to get as close to the bollards as you can. I missed it by just a little bit. Gently squeeze on the throttle as you steer, but if you get any oversteer, you want to correct that as fast as you can. You do not want to be sliding out here. You can see the 100-meter board on the left, but that's actually too far. We want to brake before the end of the fence, before the 100-meter board. The black digital sign on the left is a good place to start turning in. I should have turned in a little bit sharper, trying to get really close to this bollard and making this more of a V shape, but instead I took it a little bit more traditional and I'm just going for a late apex here. The car will understeer if you can get the rear tires to hook up, so make sure you're apexing well after the last bollard. Gently track out, but keep your eyes on the right side of the track. We're going to look for the colored part of the fence right about here. Brake as we get to these first 2 colored posts on the right, and we want to turn in before we get to the next 2 colored posts. We want to be very gentle with the brakes and come off the brakes as early as we can because it can cause understeer if we're on the brakes too long here. Remember to be very patient on the throttle here, exiting in 4th gear, correct any oversteer, and then it's a straight shot to victory. Going through full speed, there are a couple things I want you to pay attention to. I hear a lot of inexperienced drivers talk about how supercars in this game feel like they don't have any brakes, but in reality, these things are faster than race cars, but they don't have any of the suspension or aerodynamic technology that they do, so it makes a whole bunch of sense that they have to brake a lot earlier. Secondly, you pretty much want to avoid throttle oversteer, but sometimes you really can't escape it. So the best thing to do is to be very sensitive about when it's going to happen and either prepare for it or react as quickly as you can by straightening the car out and fixing that issue before it becomes a real issue. Pay attention to my steering, and by now you should know that you can see the red dot above the tack bar, but you'll notice that I'm making a lot of minor corrections throughout this entire run. Getting on the throttle early, getting a tiny bit of oversteer and correcting it immediately is going to be faster than waiting too long to get on the throttle. I really enjoyed this one, I hope you did too. If you remember the NSX test from a few tests ago, I showed you the raw footage when I first encountered it, and I'm actually going to do that again with this one, but for a completely different reason. I mentioned this before, but I really love drifting, and I live in a place where it rains 9 months out of the year, so I have a lot of experience driving rear-wheel drive cars in the wet, and because of that, I have a lot of confidence when it comes to these things, so I honestly had too much confidence, and I really attacked this one right off the bat. I probably should have just slowed down and restarted this, but I'm really stubborn and I wanted to see what I could do if I just kept going. And this is what happened. I went for a full weight transfer braking drift, hit the curb, got more oversteer, and I decided why not just go for it. I tried to balance the throttle so I could keep up my speed while also sliding. And I don't know how good the ghost was, and I didn't expect this, but yeah. Fully drifting it, we cleared gold by nearly 2/10. That was a lot of fun. I did, however, record a proper version, so let's get into it. The faster you're going, the more throttle you can usually give a car, even if it's really powerful and it can slide the tires really easily, but when it comes to the rain, sometimes you just can't floor it no matter what. Exploring the very limits of how much throttle you can give a car is really important though, so hopefully you learned how to control and anticipate oversteer from that last test. The 100 meter board is approximately where you need to brake. I want you to notice that I'm not going to 100% brake, and the maximum amount of brake that I'm giving it, I'm not going to approach that amount quickly. I'm going to gently get on the brake to make sure I don't displace the weight from the rear of the car. We want to keep the car as balanced as possible whenever we're touching the throttle or the brakes when it comes to rain driving. As we pass the 50 meter board, we want to start turning in gently, and we do want to get off the brakes as much as possible because we want to free up as much front end grip as we can. Gently get on the throttle, and if there's any oversteer, make sure you correct it as quickly as you possibly can. Whatever you do, don't panic and brake or fully come off the throttle. Before we get to the end of the curbing on the outside, we're going to add brake, and you might notice that I still have some throttle as I'm touching the brake. That allows us to slow down but not displace too much of the weight like I talked about before when I talked about not braking at 100%. Again, using the throttle to find how much we can add and then counter steering anytime we do get oversteer is key in trying to find all the speed that we can in rain driving. Mastering how much grip this car does have can allow us to really squeeze the most out of this test, but you're going to see by how much I cleared gold that you really don't need to. You just need to be able to control this car at a basic level and make your way to the end to get the gold. The penultimate test is another very complicated snow test, and it's in one of my favorite cars of all time. This is the car that I qualified for the latest Porsche Esports Challenge event in. I'm actually not very happy with this run, but we cleared it by 6 or 7 tenths, so there's a huge margin of error in this one. I'm going to show you exactly how I did it, and we're going to stop in the middle to show you what I should have done. Being careful to aim the car before you hit these bumps, we're going to look for the beginning of the orange fencing on the left, and that's where we're going to brake and try to do a bit of a Scandinavian flick into the corner. Continue braking as the car rotates, and we're going to downshift to second gear. Now here's where I made the big mistake. Looking at my steering, you can see that I completely straightened out the wheel. I don't know why I wasn't paying enough attention to this, but I started going completely wide on the exit of this corner. You can see that the Ghost is sacrificing this exit to get really close to the right-hand side of the track. That allows you to get on the throttle much earlier when you negotiate the left-hand corner. But instead of that, I just threw it incredibly sideways and then got on the throttle and tried to just navigate with the throttle, making sure I don't hit this exit wall. This probably cost me 2 or even 3/10. I was, however, able to modulate the throttle so I didn't lose too much speed as I was drifting, and then I was able to get enough speed that I was actually catching up with the Ghost, but I would not have caught up with it by the next corner if we were to go beyond the finishing line here. We ended up clearing this by nearly 7/10 though, so there's a huge margin of error. As long as you don't hit any walls, you're probably going to be able to get gold here. Hilariously enough, I actually tried this a few more times and could not beat this time, so it might actually be a pretty good technique. It's just definitely not the best technique. Going through it one more time, we use the Scandinavian flick that we learned earlier in the guide, but we make sure that we brake and slow down, downshift. Don't make the mistake I did, not sacrificing that exit and then throwing it into a big drift here, but if you do, stay confident, stay on that throttle, avoid hitting that wall, and you just might pull out the gold anyways. Because of the dynamics of rally, you can take some really creative lines and still end up going pretty fast, but that was probably too far what I did there. For the final part of the International B license test, we get to drive the newly added LFA, the legendary car that has finally made its return to the Gran Turismo series. The track in question is the world-famous Fuji International Speedway, and the sector that we have to tackle is definitely the most complicated part of the track. Like the Maserati from a couple tests back, this car has incredible power, but it does not stop or corner like a race car. This first part of the track is 2 little kinks, and we're going to hit both of those as clipping points. The bright Dunlop sign is a really good clue for when we need to brake, but we need to brake before that at the 150 meter board that you can see on the right. Braking a straight line, we're going to get down to second gear. I should have turned in at the last part where it says Dunlop on the barrier to the right, but I turned in a little bit too late. You can use first gear to tuck in the nose just a little bit more so you can put the left tires on that red and white curb, but I missed it. It didn't cost us too much time. You want to hit a very late apex on this corner, and of course go over the curb as much as you can. Be gentle on the throttle because curbs are slippery, and you want to clip as close to this bollard as you possibly can going straight over this curb. Aim for the yellow part of the barrier in the distance and try to curve your car so you barely touch the outside curb here. When we get to this line on the left, we're going to start turning in and braking. Gently brake until you can feel the car arcing towards the bollard and get back on the throttle, again very gently as you go over the curb. We want to use as much of the exit curbing as we possibly can, so aim to get your left tires on the red and white curb. Accelerate just about until you're facing this light pole in the distance and then slowly come off the throttle. Start braking when you're facing that orange part in the distance and just try to bleed off speed as you downshift to second gear. It's hard to see the shape of the curb from here, but we want to use as much of that curb as we possibly can without hitting that bollard. Back up to third, gently on throttle as we exit. Once again, we want to abuse the track limits as much as we can. You can put the left tires on the red and white curb here. Aim just to the left of this pole in the distance and then start trying to align yourself with the outside of the track. When we get to this access road on the right here, that's when we're going to start braking, trying to just slowly scrub off speed as we try to make a big arch so we can get a really good exit onto the straight. Stay in third gear and slowly scrub off speed, trying to make this one big arch, not trying to straighten your car out between the last corner and this next one. And at the end of the curb on the left, we're going to completely come off the brakes. When you're certain that your car is tracing the line that you want, you're going to get back on the throttle, using only enough throttle to not change that line. Once we get over that curb though, we're going to give as much throttle as we can without spinning the tires, and you can safely go off on this runoff, but it's got a weird shape, so if you're giving it too much throttle, if you're sliding at all, you're probably going to spin out there. From here on out, we just floor it to victory. As you can see, I'm 1.2 seconds clear of gold, so there's a huge margin of error. We'll go through it one more time, and while it wasn't perfect, the one big mistake was the very first braking zone. I should have turned in earlier and possibly dipped down to first gear to get the car to rotate so I can get on the throttle earlier, but it definitely wasn't too bad. This entire sector is about knowing exactly what line you want to take through the entirety of it and making sure that you don't do anything with the throttle or the brakes to deviate from that line. As I've discussed before, the primary function of the brakes and the throttle are to slow you down and accelerate, but their secondary function is to move the weight of the car around, and where the weight of the car is determines how it handles. This car is a lot more stable than the Maserati at Spa, but it does have enough power to slide out, so you still have to be very careful. I personally think this is one of the toughest sections of track anywhere, so don't feel bad if this one takes a long time. Watch this video, watch the breakdown, watch other guides. There are other guides available. Get as much knowledge as you can, and then be very patient with yourself as you try to figure this one out. It really is going to put all of the skills that you've accumulated to the test. Minor spoilers ahead, but you probably know this. You get a gift car if you get all golds, and of course we get the wonderful LFA. Just like the last couple tests, you get the final car that you use. I hope this guide can help you earn this car on your own. Of course, I'll be finishing off the guides with the last 2 master license tests, and if you want to see those, make sure you like and subscribe. Thank you.